Welcome to this week's Tales of Abundance. We have back for the third time one of our most popular guests. His episodes always do great, Kristian Jalloway. Welcome, Kristian.
Thank you. It's great to be back with you guys.
All right. Well, as always, I have lots of crazy questions. You're my spiritual advisor or my spiritual. I don't know. I ask you lots of crazy things. You know, I grew up in a church. The three of you all grew up Catholic. I grew up Lutheran. But you know, it was church. It was hymns. It was Sunday school. It was community. It was be kind, love your neighbor, don't lie. But then when I start going into these Bible things, so that's what the church talks about. It's wild. Like the Bible is full of some wild stuff that nobody really talks about. So, you know, a couple of things. A man gives his girlfriend to a mob to save himself. She dies. He cuts her body into 12 pieces and mails them across the country to start a civil war. You know, in another story, a king has 700 wives, 300 concubines, uses demons to build the most sacred temple in the world, right? If somebody took this stuff and pitched it as a screenplay, you would think it was a Marvel thing, right? I mean, it's full of magic and intrigue and betrayal and affairs and, war, genocide, political ghosts, magic, heroes, villains. You know, and one of the questions I'm going to ask you later is, does the Bible have a marketing problem or does the church have a marketing problem? But I just want to start with, when you think of wild stories from the Bible, what do you think of?
Yeah, man, you're right. There are so many. You know, there's mostly in the Old Testament. So I actually, you gave me a little bit of a sneak peek into some of these questions. So I went back and looked, and I've got my Bible here. So in Genesis, you remember the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So Sodom is this horrible, wicked place, and God says, okay, I'm going to destroy them. Abraham's like, well, can you find one good person, et cetera, et cetera. He finally founds one just person, and God decides to destroy the city, but save the guy who's Lot. His name is Lot. So anyways, they flee the city. The whole thing of his wife actually looks back at the burning city and turns to a pillar of salt. Not super fun to start with. But then the crazy story is they go up and so he's living with his two daughters up in this cave in the mountains, and they assume they're the last people on earth. And so his daughters actually get him drunk, sleep with him, they both get pregnant and have children, one named Moab, who's the founder of the Moabite tribe, which is an ancient people. And the other one had a son named Ben-Ami, I think, the father of the Ammonites. And so incest, intrigue, you know, and these people are now part of God's people on earth. I mean, later they're important people in the Bible. And so it's just, yeah, I agree with you. There's crazy stories that we don't think about, and certainly not decent enough to talk about at Sunday school, or, you know, clean enough that a pastor is going to bring them up on Sunday in his homily. Like, not what you typically hear about. And yet the Bible is full of that kind of stuff.
Well, like there's a prophet gets mocked. A prophet gets mocked by children, right, for being bald. All right. So I feel this guy's pain.
Watch out.
But anyway, he curses them, and two bears come out and maul 42 kids. Like, that's a story in the Bible. Like, what is that story doing there? Like, why? I mean, what is it doing there? And follow-up question, why is that kind of stuff not brought up in church?
Yeah, I think for, you know, the obvious reason it's not brought up is it's just hard to deal with. Like, how do you reconcile that? One, by the way, like, I think we've created this version of the Bible and this version of Christianity in particular that's like very Sunday school appropriate. You know, it's all flowers and butterflies and all, like, Jesus is this figure that's like, you know, not to call out Anthony here, but like a kind of hippie, nice, fun-loving guy. And like, that's not really what you get if you read the whole Bible, or even just the parts on Jesus. Like, he went and overturned the tables, you know, in Jerusalem, right? In the Holy of Holies, in the temple. So not the Holy of Holies, but in the temple. So I think we get into this our version of what we want it to be like, and just emphasize those aspects instead of looking at the whole thing that's harder to deal with. Like, I took that one about the mauling, and you can look at different commentators and things and see, like, is there a way to justify it? Maybe the way Which, by the way, there's people who study this and look at the ancient texts and the language and look at the original languages and, whether it's Hebrew or Greek for the New Testament, et cetera. And like, there is a lot you can study because there's a lot lost in translation over time. So you do need to go back and do those things, and you can see, maybe it was more like a teenage gang kind of thing. And there's 42 teenagers mocking this guy who's, whatever the reason is, because he's bald. It could be dangerous. So, and then he actually prays to God. He curses them, which, maybe justifiable, maybe not, but it's God who sends the bears that then maul the kids. So you're like, okay, I can kind of see a different angle in that interpretation of it as well. And at the same time, this is pretty bad stuff. Like, this is evil stuff.
Wasn't there kind of a change in the rules though with the new covenant? Like there was a way things worked before the new covenant, and then the new covenant came and kind of reset to a different set of rules.
Explain that, John. John, explain the new covenant versus the old covenant. So
I'm gonna let Kristian explain. He's gonna be much better at that than I am.
Okay.
We brought this up a little bit in one of the first podcasts, I think, on this topic, because yes, like the rule or the given moral code, so to speak, before Moses was pretty brutal. And it was roughly like, one of my cousins gets hurt, I hurt 7 of yours. So is 7-1 on the ratio of more evil than good. And it's basically tribal warfare, which we still see in parts of the world. I mean, and I think like our tendency as humans goes that direction if we don't have a higher moral code. So Moses comes along and receives the 10 commandments and all that, and the moral code gets changed to 1-to-1, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, which sounds brutal compared to today's reality. But it probably, if you go to places in Africa, like, or even heck in first world countries, like that could be an improvement, right? And then Jesus brings the new covenant. So the old covenant had its rules and systems and moral code. And Jesus comes and says, no, you have to forgive your enemies. Never heard of before. And so, yes, there's been a progression in the moral code. And if you look at the Old Testament compared to the New Testament, particularly the book of Judges, which is where that one comes up, and a lot of these things about the Judges is the book in the Old Testament where there was no king in Israel, and basically is showing like, what does it look like without a king, without a God? Like it's mayhem. It's bad. So there has been a progression in that moral code. And today we kind of look back and judge them even just a few years ago, right? I mean, you look at like United States, right? Slavery was common for most of the world's history. And yet now that we've realized kind of as a collective that slavery is a bad thing, we look back and judge those people by today's standards, not always trying to put ourselves in their shoes at their time, which is kind of funny. This just is anecdote, but last night one of my 5-year-old is like, Daddy, treat me like a slave. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? But he had never heard of a slave, and they're studying something. And he's like, I think he thought it was just going to be a funny game. And I'm like, how do I do that in a nice way to a 5-year-old? And not like, it was just a funny moment as a dad, but it definitely made me think about these things. Like he has no idea what it's really like, right? He's just studying in history.
So my real takeaway from all this, Old Covenant, New Covenant, is a few weeks ago, Anthony made a bald joke about me. So I should have God curse him, or pray to God to curse him so the bears come maul him. That's my takeaway.
But it's funny you say that. I think that's a lot of people's takeaway is they go back to whichever part of the Bible they think is the part that fits that their sentiment in the moment, the way that they want to play the rules of the game. But the rules of the game for Christians have changed. You don't get to choose which timeline you're on. Like we're in a period that is set out, if you're a Christian, by God. And so you don't get to go backwards to other places because it feels good in the moment. I think it's a historical account, and it's important that we understand history so we don't go back there. But that's a tough one, even for a lot of Christians, right?
Yeah. I want to take us.
I don't want.
I know, but sometimes we all want an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, right? Like it's just true.
My training is always to ask, why, right? Ask the why question 5 times. So Kristian talked to us at a lunch recently, and I learned that the Bible wasn't an official until 400 AD or so. So I know you're talking about these wild stories, Randy, kings and magic and genocide and so forth. And the question in my mind is, why were these stories put in there in the first place? What was the genesis of it all? Why were these scholars who looked at all the ancient texts, and there was, hundreds of prophets, micro religions and micro communities in different places as the earth was expanding its population and different cultures were forming. Why did they choose what they chose? What was behind not just the crazy stories or the ugly stories, but everything else that's in there? It seems incongruous to have, thou shalt not kill, and then have all these stories about, the genocide and things like that. So I'm I'm a bit of a skeptic, if you will, and I kind of call this the, historical fiction. The Bible is historical fiction, but I would still want to know why.
Yeah.
And I have my opinions of it, but I would love to hear from Kristian to have him kind of inform me and take me off my soapbox.
I'll see if I can do it. I think, yeah, the most interesting thing, I've had this conversation, right, with lots of different types of Christians. And after the Reformation, the majority of Christians, well, I don't know the majority, but, they followed Luther and then Calvin and kind of that branch of Christianity of the Reformed Christian churches took the Bible as their sole source of truth, sola scriptura, they say. So, but there's an inherent contradiction there, because if you go and say, well, where does the Bible say that the Bible is the only source of truth for Christians? It doesn't. There is no place. And so when you look at how Christianity, or how the Bible, both Old Testament, but definitely the New Testament, came to be, it really came about through tradition first. So in other words, the spoken, passed on traditions and stories of this people who believed, and whether it is the Old Testament, the Jewish tribes that were following after Abraham, and, the journeying in the desert for 40 years and all those things were all traditions. There were oral traditions, which is consistent with history. Like, I mean, when was the printing press wasn't invented until, much, much later. And oral, traditions were the norm, and written traditions were very hard to maintain. It was papyrus and materials that were very hard to, translate, and books were extremely expensive. So you had these monks in the Middle Ages copying down versions of the Bible. And we know there were a lot of errors in that. As much as they tried to do it faithfully, I'm sure there were just human mistakes. And then translating, again, we already said that, from one language to another. So all that being said, I think that messiness can, on one hand, lead us to say, okay, it's just all fiction. Or on the other hand, I think there's another option: look at it under faith, or in the light of faith, and say, actually, it kind of makes sense. Like, God uses humanity with all of our messiness and imperfections to teach us about what it means to really be a human, about who God is, and that's the church. And the church is still extremely messy today. I mean, messy is an understatement, right? I mean, Pope John Benedict, actually, one point, I remember I was there in Rome, outside the Colosseum, when they do the Way of the Cross on Good Friday, and remember Christ's steps along to getting killed. And he said, it was a brutal statement, but in Spanish, or in Italian, it was something like, he spoke about the dirtiness of the church, but the word he described it was like that nasty gunk you get in your sink, like down underneath, where you can never get to clean out, It's like that was the junk and the gunk that he described in the church. And he knew it. I mean, he was in Rome. He was the Pope. He got all the reports and stuff. And all the abuse crisis we were going through at that time was horrible, and still is. So all that being said, the formation in the books of the Bible, especially the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were not written, well, except for Matthew, who was an apostle. So he was with Jesus. The others were written by people who were friends of the apostles. So, and there's lots of different interpretations on this, and opinions, and historical research has different opinions, but it definitely came through that. And then the church found, okay, these are the books that comply with that tradition, and these are ones that don't. And so there was a big debate whether there should have been just one scripture, right? One gospel instead of four, because they're all kind of, especially the first three, the synoptics they're called, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are all kind of just variations on the same basic stories. John was written a little bit later and had kind of a more theological approach. So he was written for a different audience and kind of different focus. But it is interesting. I mean, we could get into the details of each one, but it's not a simple, easy process. And I think there's different ways to look at, both how it happened, but also why it happened that way.
So, all right, I'm a long ways from a biblical scholar, but in my research, I'm going back to magic. King Saul, right? He was God's first choice as king. He banned all magic and necromancy across the land. Then he secretly went to a witch to summon the ghost of a dead prophet. It worked. Samuel wrote that the ghost appears, gets angry, predicts Saul's death, and the next day he dies. Right? So this is kind of where Anthony, why is it in there? But I don't know. I just think about that. I think about what do we do with that, right? Like we're supposed to believe all these things in the Bible, but here we're talking about magic and necromancy and it working. And there's other stuff where Solomon, you and I have talked about casting spells or curses again, and God is making a whole army, incapacitated. What are we supposed to do with that kind of stuff?
Man, that's a great question. Part of it is we have to wrestle with it. I mean, even stuff that seems pretty benign. I meet with a group of families on a pretty regular basis, and we talk about this stuff, and we just take a scripture passage and talk about it and pray about it. And a lot of times there's wow, I forgot that was in there. What does that mean? What does that mean originally, when they wrote it? But what does it mean for me today as well? And we were talking about one actually just a couple days ago. It was about you have to love God more than your family. And we're like, gosh, that's brutal. I mean, as parents, do I really love God more than my kids? And then, it kind of struck me because we were getting ready to go to church the next day. And I was like, I think we actually make that decision every single time we decide to take our kids to church because they complain so much. If I just loved my kids just straight out and more than God, I would not be taking them to church. I was like, this is a clear decision. We think God is more important. We're going to still drag them to church and try to get them to behave. And so anyways, but all, the Old Testament is still much harder, right? And those kinds of things, in one version of that or one understanding of that would be, he went against, because when he did that, he did get who was the Saul, right? The dead prophet to come back. And the witch who he went to actually was kind of shocked. It says she was in terror. So she wasn't, I don't think, expecting it to happen, but God probably made it happen. I think ghosts are real. I mean, if you believe in life after death, you can't really say that ghosts aren't real. Now, how they act and all those things, you believe in angels, you believe in dead people who are not fully dead, right? Why wouldn't ghosts be possible? Now, that's probably not, I don't think that's quite what it looks like in the movies, probably. But his ghost comes back and he tells him basically I'm already dead. And because you're doing all this stuff, you shouldn't be, you banned magic and yet you're using magic to get what you want. You're going to die tomorrow. And he does. So pretty brutal answer. And I think, our job isn't really to get it or understand it. I think that's kind of a false idea of if only I knew more, I could somehow control God or control the Bible or stuff like that. I'm kind of afraid of people who think they know too much about the Bible. And I'm actually kind of afraid of who I used to be when I was preaching different things. I was so sure about different things. I'm much more open-minded now today because I think it's actually a safer place to be. You've got to wrestle with these things. And I don't know all the answers. I mean, this is the Bible and the church over thousands of years. How am I supposed to know exactly what it's supposed to mean?
So, all right, let's go. Saul is replaced then by King David, but during King David, and again, I think the Bible calls him a man after God's own heart. But before he was king, he was raiding villages, killing everyone so they couldn't reporting, and lying to foreign kings about it. I don't know. How is that the guy, right? Like how is that God's chosen? Like, isn't
Yeah.
that? I mean, kind of the same thing, right? Like, we're this is after the 10 Commandments. There's a whole bunch of commandments being broken there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and he's punished for it. So, but the king is not taken away from him. And so then it says his punishment is actually passed down to generations later, which is interesting. But all the good things he does, I don't think are eliminated because of the evil he does, which is a hard lesson. And also, yeah, like even God's chosen can go astray. Like you can be doing really well. You can be having the perfect life and you got to still pay attention. Like things can, if you let yourself, I mean, actually that's an interesting one because it says there's a line there where it starts that part of the Bible where it says, in the spring, at the time that kings go to war, blah, blah, blah. Then he sees Bathsheba bathing, etc. So he's not doing his duty. His job, which is kind of weird too, but that was the normal thing in the Old Testament. It was like in the springtime, winter's over, we get our troops together and we go to war. That's just what they did. But he doesn't do his duty. He's not leading the army. He's staying home in the castle, having a good time while he sends his army off to do battle.
Yeah, I mean, the
That's when he gets in
Bathsheba
trouble.
thing, like he sends her husband to war, so basically he can die and he can steal her away.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
after he brings her over, and of course, what's she gonna say? The king calls for you, you go, right? And then he sleeps with her. She gets pregnant. When he finds out, then he tries to eliminate her husband by sending him into the thickest part of the battle. It doesn't work. Oh no, sorry. He calls for her husband to come from the battlefield and have like a time off, but he refuses because he wants to do his duty. So he refuses to go into his wife. He's like sleeps on his front porch basically, and then goes back to the battle, which is even another like gut wrenching. David, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. Then he sends secret messengers to say, yeah, we're going to go and attack, have him in the front line, and everybody pull back and let him get killed. And so then the prophet comes and calls him out and says, hey, gives him this story to kind of tell him what happened. And he's like, I will kill that man. It's like, it's you who did this. Right. So it's fascinating. I mean, for me, I think of it like, how am I doing God's will, or where am I in accord with the plan, and where do I still screw up? Thankfully I've never killed somebody in that way. And if I were king, how do I know I wouldn't? I mean, I wrestle with this politically speaking. You look at different political parties and different wars and things, and you're like, I don't know how to justify that. I mean, I'm glad I'm not in their shoes. I don't have to, but it's really hard. I mean, to try to justify any kind of violence when you compare it to the Bible. If you take the Old Testament, it's easy to justify. There's violence everywhere. It's a normal thing. If you look at the New Testament, it's much harder to justify. So,
well, even with that, I want to go deeper here. This is one that you and I have talked about 2 or 3 times. The whole "thou shalt not kill," right? That's one of the 10 Commandments, and I guess maybe my presumption is wrong, but I think of the 10 Commandments the way we talk about core values, right? Like those are kind of like a lot of core values of the church, the same way a company has core values. And "thou shalt not kill" is really about as clear as it could be. I don't know how anybody can misconstrue that. Yet people have used the church and the Bible to, promote wars, genocide, all kinds of stuff over the years. Like, how do Christians, I don't know. I mean, I just see hypocrisy here. So what says you?
Yeah, it's, the basic commandment is super clear. It gets messy really quickly as soon as you start to try to apply it. And I think people start finding excuses, or not, maybe excuses is maybe too harsh a term, but like, what do you do if you're living in again, in the United States, we don't really feel this much, but what if you were? If you're living, you're the father of the family, somebody breaks into your house and wants to rape your family, your kids, your wife, and steal everything, like, what do you do? And some people, the answer is that's your job as a Christian, to do nothing and just pray for them. And others like, well, I think it's justifiable, even based on the commandments, to defend your family, even with lethal force. This was actually the reason, by the way, that the early Christians became a persecuted group, because when the Romans came to destroy Jerusalem, the early Christians, this was right after after Jesus' death, shortly after, the early Christians actually took the Pacific route. Like, they said, they actually left Jerusalem, went off and lived in the desert until the war was over, and then went back to Jerusalem. And the Jewish, their Jewish brethren, because they were all Jews at that point, right? Some believed in Jesus, some didn't. So the Christian Jews left and then came back, and all their brethren were like, "You guys abandoned us. You're clearly not part of us," right? And that's when they basically told the Jews, that the Jews started persecuting the Christians in that way, and then the Romans did, etc. So, if you take a very strict reading of the New Testament, and there's lots of people who have, then it would be a no violence at all. And in today's world, then how do you live that out, right? Especially if you have some sort of responsibility to somebody else and it's not just yourself.
Well, there seems to me a pretty clear line between defending your family and, say, going to war. Like, I just see it. It seems like every war, like this Iran thing, there's multiple people that are, talking about, God wants us to go fight this war, right? I mean, like Anthony and John and I got in an argument about this a couple months ago. I think you were there on the side, but, this whole Iran war, right? And to me, it's really clear. Like, don't go frickin' kill people over there. It never works out for us. Like, all these wars keep going on. I think that if we followed the thou shalt not kill and stop bombing people and killing people, and it would be better for us, better for them. I mean, we suffer through, printing money and inflation and everything else, but I don't know. I mean,
I think that's definitely a justifiable position, especially biblically speaking. And you're right. Like, it gets, again, I'm not the president. I don't have to make those decisions. If I were, what would I do as a Christian? I don't know. I mean, you can go back, and I think we've talked about this a little bit. Like, the Catholic Church has a list of, in Catholic social teaching, of what makes for a justifiable war. One of the things that's not really spoken about very clearly, though, is the wording is typically one that was more from the Middle Ages. So I don't know if it really fully applies in modern warfare. And there's a lot of things that the church taught about warfare throughout the Middle Ages. That was, again, kind of based on like this assumption that, like, this is what's going to happen. We need to teach people how to do it more, or in a better way, and not in a worse way. But in today's modern warfare, I don't know if that's still the best or the most up-to-date version of it. But one of the things it seems very clear to imply, which is maybe a contradiction, but it seems to imply that it's always going to be a defensive war. And, with the United States as basically the hegemon, or the, global power, can we really have a defensive war in today's reality for the United States? I mean, other countries, I think, can, but that's a really tough one. I mean,
yeah, it's confusing. In doing my research, again, I didn't know this stuff, but just digging into it, there's a place where Jesus told his disciples to sell their coats and buy swords. So that's
right.
one message, right? Then when Peter actually used one, which I didn't dig deep enough I don't know that story. Jesus healed the guy and said, all who draw the sword will die by the sword. All in one chapter, right? And so, and there's a Luke chapter where it says buy a sword. There's a Matthew chapter where it says put it away. I mean, there's just multiple different messages.
Yeah. He cut off. Clearly, Peter was a fisherman, not a soldier, because all he managed to do was cut the guy's ear off, and then Jesus heals it like instantaneously, and so you're like, wow, lots going on here. But I agree with you. And so I think John said it, like if you cherry pick the verses, right, or the stories, it's easy to create the narrative you want. It's much, much harder to take the Bible as a whole and look at the overall message and then apply it to your life and different, areas like this. So, war is one of those things that it's like, I think most people that I talk to, most serious Christians who are really trying to live their faith have an attitude of war is always bad. I mean, I don't think anybody would say war is good. I mean, or certainly not with a Christian perspective on the world. I think at best you can try to justify it in different ways and say it's necessary. But that's a far shot from saying it's a good thing to do, right? Or like violence is good.
Well, and when I was talking about my argument with Anthony and John, I don't think they were saying war was good or they wanted it or anything like that. They thought it was necessary, justified, and I would say self-defense. I mean, you guys correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I that's the way I took it, even though I didn't agree with you. So, Anthony, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think for me, Randy, I don't, self-defense would be the place that I would say, hey, I think that there's a justification in many cases. And I am not in any way a just warfare scholar, but I have to admit that I think there are times when self-defense is appropriate. So,
well, Kristian made the point about picking and choosing, and while I was dropping my microphone, I poked around a little bit. And there is significant differences between the King James version of the Ten Commandments and the more modern translation. And one that came up is "Thou shalt not kill" is now more commonly translated as "Thou shalt not murder." So that draws a big distinction, Randy, between warfare and murder, which is implying for no reason you shouldn't kill someone, which then opens up the Pandora's box of reasoning when you should be involved in killing, perhaps. So I find it really interesting how over time, again, it's how much of I just struggle with this, from how much of this is apocryphal and just, to be used for, you guys are not going to like what I'm about to say, but is organized religion in the context of what we're talking about, or was organized religion created, if you will, this massive group of Christianity? Is it really just cosmetically different than Marxism, Leninism, Mein Kampf? All the writings of those people had served the purpose to control a populace, to enrich a small part of the class, if you will, the population. Is the Bible just another version of that it was created in a way because a group wanted to obtain power and control over a huge population of people through a set of rules and enough fear that people just followed it off a cliff? So that's kind of where I'm struggling with
it's
that.
a fair question. I think everyone should be willing to engage in the discussion and a dialogue around it, right? Because I think that people who are pretty faithful and theologically, versed would have a pretty good argument for why that's not the case. But I think there's an equal argument about, like, could it have been then moved into that? Like, is it possible that parts of today's church have morphed into a political machine rather than a religious machine? And certainly I think that's a fair question, right?
Yeah. Well, there's parts in history, like it was very clear. So the very early Christians, if you look at historical development of Christianity, were like this tiny minority sect that had no power, and they all ended up many of them ended up getting killed. So it'd be hard to just have that perspective in the early church. And most people agree on that part. But then as it gets into the Middle Ages, right, the church becomes, in the year 700, you have the well, first Constantine and then the other emperors who become Christian, and then power and religion are very much intermingled, if not exactly the same thing. And there are struggles between the crown and the Pope and all that, right? In the year 800, then Charlemagne is crowned by the Pope, though. So now, like, political power and religious power are very much linked. And that leads to a lot of bad stuff too, right? And then it leads to the Crusades, and it leads to all these other things. It leads to, and you can make, again, you want to understand those things historically in their context and not just judge them from today's lens. But still, I mean, wasn't I think your perspective in those years is much more clearly like, yes, it was controlling. Then again, the Reformation comes in the 1500s, and that starts to split, and you get to today's reality where, I mean, today I don't think anybody thinks the church has much power. I mean, who listens to the church? I mean, other than their members, but I mean, there's much less, if not zero control, I would say, based from churches on today's political reality. I mean, maybe Hexteth or other people who are very strong Christians trying to bring that back. I don't know, but I don't think that's going to happen. Like, but yeah, there's, another way, like, to think of that is like, if you wanted to control somebody, what are the ways to do that? Like, financially, Randy writes your book. I see your book in the background, right? You talk about financial control. You can control them, kind of sexually. You can try to. That's more like other religions. I mean, Christianity, though, has its kind of version of like sexual morality that they talk about. You could try to control them, of course, politically and things. So there's different ways there's control. But if you wanted to be really narcissistic and control somebody in a malevolent way, what better way than to use religion, which talks about like the heart of man? Like, and I think there's examples of this. I mean, heck, I was basically in a Catholic sect controlled by a man who was evil. I mean, he was a priest, right? Who was evil, and as best I can tell, now he created this amazing thing and got a lot of people involved in it, and it was a great fundraiser and all these things, and a lot of, in a way, did some really good stuff for the church, or some good stuff maybe came out of it, is a better way to say it. But I think that's definitely I guess, temptation, right? And from my perspective, it's not what the heart of organized religion is or what the purpose of it is, but it happens, and it continues to happen. It has happened. And so definitely, a scary part of it.
I'll give you something to think about. You said this guy's evil, and I tend to agree with you, but I just want to ask the question. Compare him to David or Saul or Solomon, or, on this episode, we've talked about David and Saul, right? And you made a comment earlier that, they did all these bad things, but then did that outweigh the good that they did, right? I mean, I think the same grace could be given to this guy. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, you know better. And look, I tend to agree with you. That's pretty about as unforgivable as you can get, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a hard thing. I mean, it's easy. And I think as a kid, I was definitely this way. You want things to be black or white. It's really easy to say, okay, this political party or this person, what it is, they're good, they're a great person, or they're bad, or they're like, I'm very allergic to that kind of thing, like putting people on a pedestal and then labeling them either good or evil, or honestly, almost any label, even just like Catholic or Protestant. It was like, that's just a cop out. Like, get to know their story, get to know their person. There's way more gray in the world than there is black or white, whether it's in any one religious group or in any person for that matter. Like, the division between good and evil, and it wasn't me who said this, it was some pope or something. It was like, it's like in the middle of our own hearts. That's a much harder reality to face than it is to just put people in boxes and try to simplify life, which feels good. It makes me feel more certain. And I think people do that with all kinds of things, whether it's, again, politics or religion or anything. But it's much harder to struggle with the reality that, yeah, I have evil tendencies in my own heart, and I have to be aware of those. And I have evil things that I do. Like, I've got to ask forgiveness for those and go talk to the people I've hurt, whether it's knowingly or unknowingly. So I agree with you too, right? it's tough though when you're talking to somebody who has been abused by a priest, for example, or by anybody, and tell them that's not an evil person. So those are kinds of conversations that you can have in certain contexts, but you need to be aware of, again, their story and who you're talking to.
The standard Jesus set, Randy, was super high, right? It wasn't like thou shalt not kill or murder, right? It was like even having a thought about those things was considered, a sin. And I think that's part of that new covenant, right? Like there's the easy part about forgiveness and kindness, but then there's a standard that gets set that's entirely different. And so I think that's for me as a not a cradle Catholic, a guy that converted to the faith later in my life, like one of the big struggles for me is the Bible oftentimes seems to conflict in its message sometimes. And I've got to really wrestle with that, as Kristian mentioned earlier. And sometimes that's where a lot of the growth comes from, is in that wrestling match.
Give us some examples.
Go ahead, John.
Of where it conflicts.
The
I
way
think
you
talked about
you had
like
a struggle.
an eye for an eye versus being forgiving, or having enough self-awareness to recognize that when you have a foul thought, that itself is a sin. Or for me, I remember brand new to the faith, and there's this part of what we do in church. We say, I'm not worthy that you should enter under my roof, but only say the word and I shall be healed. And at first I was like, well, screw that, I am too worthy. And then it was like, wait a second. And it took me a couple of years to really like get comfortable with that saying, because it was like this, this version of like, I'm worthy. And it's like, but that's not the point of what we're saying. What we're saying is that we're not Jesus. Like, it's given freely to me. It's being given as a gift, not because I've earned it, but being given freely as a gift is my salvation. And so that was but I will tell, I mean, I haven't shared that with anybody before. Now I'm sharing it publicly. Like, that took me more than a year to get comfortable with that and really understand, and lots of conversations with spiritual directors and priests about like, man, I'm not comfortable saying I'm not worthy, but then getting really, and you guys know humility is not my strong suit. Like, I'm not the natural when it comes to humility. And so that took a real kind of a bit of humility to get comfortable with that. So that would be one really crystal clear example.
Kristian, where is that written? The I am not worthy. Is that in the New Testament, the Old Testament? Where is that?
That's in the New Testament. That's, I think, at it's actually the Roman soldier who asked Jesus to heal I think it was his slave or servant or something. And Jesus said, great, I'll go to your house. And he says, no, I'm not worthy for you to enter under my roof. Just say the word and they shall be healed. So it was a specific encounter with a person. I forgot exactly where it is, but those kinds of things are common, and there's been a progression even since the Bible was written and copied down. And so if you look at certain people who have lived it out really well, like Saint Teresa of Avila, for example, who lived in the Middle Ages, I think in I forgot exactly, 1200s, something like that, or 1500s. Anyways, Saint Teresa of Avila and John Eldridge and people like big Christian authors quote her, even if they're not Catholic. But she came up with this idea of spiritual progression that is not even found in the Bible itself. She calls it the 7 levels of the interior castle. So she lives in Spain, and so she imagined a castle, and you go in and there's like the moat, there's the courtyard, there's various internal rooms. And she imagines that is your own heart, and you're going through these castle rooms, getting closer and closer to the source, which is Jesus himself. And so she describes what the progression should look like for a Christian who's trying to get more and more perfect. And if you read the levels and what the expectations are for each of those levels, it is shockingly hard. I mean, you look at like a customer journey, right? If you're a business person, you're like, okay, there's various things you should do as you become a better customer, so to speak. I mean, if you looked at that as a customer journey for a Christian, it's extremely difficult. And I think most people get maybe to the first or second level. The 7th level is like mystics who are having regular contemplation directly of God. Like, it's basically, you're almost in heaven, even if you're not in heaven yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. The premise of that statement, that I am not worthy, is painful for me to listen to and hear, because it's a form of control. You are not worthy. I am not worthy. So I'm starting out at the lowest rung of the ladder, and I have to prove to my God that I in fact, I am worthy. And here,
Yeah, but Anthony,
so I may
that's
be
the
reading
miss,
that
right?
wrong. It's rubbing
That's
me
where I
the wrong
was.
way.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was with it. And so it's different. It's more like the parent that I say to my son, like he's like, I'm worthy of your love. It's like you don't have to be. Like worthy of my love, unworthy of my love. I love you unconditionally. There's nothing you can do to not be loved by me. There's nothing you can do to earn my love because you don't have to earn my love. It's freely given. And there's nothing you could ever do to earn it because you don't need to earn it. It's freely given. And there's nothing you can ever do to have me stop loving you. And so I think I was getting it backwards, right? Which was I have to prove myself to you. And it's the opposite of that, which is you don't have to ever prove yourself to me, right? Like that is and this led to a conversation with the spiritual director of me, later on, where we were talking about unconditional love. And she said to me, it takes great humility to accept unconditional love. And I broke down in tears. And I mean, it was like, because it's not about worthiness. It's not about that. It's someone's giving you a gift with no strings attached.
John,
Christian's earlier point, though, about people wanting things black and white. I read that literally. I hear that literally. And, I grew up in the Catholic Church and went to, Catholic school early in my life, early elementary school. And man, you talk about black and white. I mean, if you go to Mass on 9 consecutive First Fridays, you are guaranteed a place in heaven. I mean, that's about as black and white as it can get.
Yeah.
I'll give you the rest of the list, over dinner sometime.
Yeah.
well, I think that's a human. I mean, so much of this, by the way, I want to make clear, I'm not trying to rip on religion or, the Bible or whatever. Like so much of this, I think, has been rotted by human influence over the time, right? And even like most humans have a need for certainty, and they don't like the ambivalence, or they don't like well, here it says buy a sword, or, and here it says don't use it. Right. And I think that's hard for humans in general to get their head around it. But to me, as I think about it, that maybe is one of the lessons from the Bible, is that, to ask more questions and think about it and be more comfortable in that place of uncertainty. And John, you said something that really stuck out to me earlier. You said Jesus thought about, like, not just thou shalt not kill, but thinking about it. And a couple weeks ago, you brought up there's 2 things we can control: your thoughts and your actions, right? So thou shalt not kill is the actions, and thinking about it is the thoughts. And it aligns, really nicely with that. But let's, in the interest of time, I think we're gonna stop this and have a part 4 with Kristian next week. So if you're still listening, you love us, download, subscribe, tell your friends, and we will be back with more questions with Kristian next week.
Great job, guys.
Here are tales of abundance. We know that fitness is just as important as money or milestones. It's one of our key 5 F's for lots of us. Taking care of my body while I build my life is one of the more time-consuming and difficult goals to chase. That's why we're partnering with AG1. It's a daily drinkable habit. Less than a minute, that's formulated with 75 plus vitamins and nutrients and designed to support energy, digestion, and immune defense. It even has a few grams of protein that we're all chasing these days. And if you want to try it with our affiliate link, you'll also receive a free AG1 flavor sampler, plus vitamin D3 plus K2 with your welcome kit when you first subscribe, a $72 value. Go to shop.drinkag1.com/tales.
Welcome back for the Abundance Briefing. John, Anthony, Dave Ramsey came out with his own study. He did a national study of millionaires, 10,000 participants, largest survey ever of its kind. The headline is that 69% of American millionaires did it without ever making $100,000 a year. I think that would be surprising to most people. I'll say that again. 69% of millionaires in America have never made $100,000 in a year. 1 in 3 never had a 6-figure salary at any point in their career. 89% are first-generation millionaires, so they didn't inherit their wealth. In fact, only 3% inherited $1 million or more. 79%, in fact, it got no inheritance at all. Now, here's what I think is really interesting, too. Top 5 careers by percentage of millionaires. I think a lot of people, what you would guess is not what it actually is. Number 1, engineer. Number 2, accountant, CPA. Number 3 is teacher. Number 4 is management. Number 5 is attorney. I would assume most people would think doctors would come in there, but they're number 6, actually. And only 15% were VP or C-suite roles. And, most of them just did it without having big salaries. Another key behavior, 8 out of 10 invested in a company 401k, and 75% invested consistently over a long period of time. And, anyway, 94% lived on less than they make. So what's your guys' biggest takeaway from this?
AOC is wrong, right?
Go ahead.
You know I was going to say that. This is, we talked about different ways to, die with zero, and different ways to live your life depending on the season of your life and so forth. And what this says is, steady and slow and steady wins the race. These are fundamental investment strategies, long-term, well thought out, people with that are able to delay gratification, and they plan for a future. And there's a lot more than you think, so I think it's very surprising. The number's surprising to me. The methodology is not. This is the way to do it. Going back years when 401ks first got started, the lower, I hate using that term lower, but people that were not in management positions, or, kind of either call center people or working the machines and so forth, they would opt out of 401ks to the point where the government stepped in and said, too many people making too much money are being overcompensated in these 401ks. Now, my understanding is now when you join a company, you're opted in. So you have to physically opt yourself out. So I think that's actually a good thing. But yeah, this is great. This is good news for people, and hopeful news. Very, very abundant news.
John?
When I was really young, I had a mentor of mine gave me a book called The Wealthy Barber, and he talked about how to become a millionaire as a barber. And this is like the early 90s when I read the book. And so $1 million was probably a little harder to make then than it is today. And it's real simple. Live below your means and save every month, and put that savings into something that generates not cash flow, but generates returns, and in the stock market being the one that's most commonly talked about. So I'd say that, The Wealthy Barber, amazing book. There's another book I read later called Smart Couples Finish Rich by David Bach that I thought was amazing. There's a couple books by Thomas Stanley, who's an academic researcher who studied tens of thousands of people. He got, really in-depth answers from about 750 or so millionaires, and he studied millionaires and decamillionaires. And it's the same stuff. It's be patient. It's be disciplined. It's long-term. Susie Orman, same message, right? Spend less, earn more, save, long-term gratification, delayed gratification. Like, I think most successful people say something similar. And I do think that there's something to the die with zero where you want to make sure that you enjoy yourself along the way when you're capable of doing it. So, but I think both, right? You can do both. And so I'm a huge fan of this type of data for people to get in their hands.
Well, my mentor is a young kid. I mean, I think it was 12 when I bought my first stock, Tyler Corporation. My Uncle John, he said to me then, and I've never forgotten it, he said, you need to maximize your doubling periods. The rule is 72. If you're, going to make 6% annual return, every 12 years, your portfolio will double, and so on and so forth. He said, maximize your doubling periods. I didn't follow his advice 100%, but I do remember it. And later in life, I started to follow it more religiously, if you will. So,
well,
yeah.
What's interesting to me, I mean, you look at engineers, accountants, or CPAs, right? 1, 2. Number 3 is teacher, which I think is probably one of the more surprising ones on there. But, I have teachers in my family, and I know a lot of engineers, and all of those people, the top 3, they tend to be very disciplined, right? And they have the ability to very simply spend less than they make and live below their means, and then invest and let, really that's what it comes down to, right? And they're conservative. They're not taking big swings. They're not, I think one of the big things is they don't have the years where they lose it all. They tend to have very conservative, straightforward investments.
Randy, when you and I worked with a guy early in our careers that said part of what you make is yours to keep. And he talked to, Ken Schmidt, I think, got that from Dom Muehlrath, right? So those guys were really
sorry.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah. But the bottom line is that you pay yourself. The government pays themselves first with payroll taxes, but then you pay yourself next. And if you take it out automatically and you never see it in your paycheck, even just a few dollars, it can build really quickly. And there's so many of these great programs today, and the miracle of compounding interest is such an amazing thing. And just even just talking about this right now made me think I need to go back and talk to my kids and make sure they're remembering all these lessons that we have. And so anyway, great stuff.
All right, let's move to the next topic. SpaceX, Elon Musk has bought a laser tech company that could connect AI in space. Basically, the company is called Mesh Optical Technologies. And what I think is really interesting about this, I mean, just instead of the way AI chips are connected now, it will use lasers. And this is going to be unbelievably beneficial as they're building, a constellation of satellites in space and eventually a Dyson swarm and all that. But it even makes regular data centers on Earth more efficient. And what they're finding is now they're going to be able to build these data centers and make them more electricity efficient, even on Earth. And when we talk about AI needing compute and needing energy, I think these are the types of breakthroughs and technologies that never get considered because how could they? It's new. Nobody knows it exists other than maybe a few people. And we don't know what's going to come 3, 6, 9 months. So I think that prices of all of this stuff, including energy, I think this is a big part of our search for abundance, is just little pieces of efficiency stacked on top of each other simultaneously. What says you?
This unlocked kind of my plebeian understanding of how we were going to have data centers in space. I was wondering, how do you get information back and forth? And it makes so much sense. They've used lasers to pick up sound on windows in all of the spy movies I've seen in James Bond for 40 years. It all makes sense now. It's lasers inside, fiber optic cables have used light to move information inside fiber optics forever. When I heard this, for my non-engineering brain, it was that aha moment about it made it very real for me. And no surprise that Elon's putting the pieces together. No surprise that the people that built the company came out of SpaceX.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. This goes way over my head from a technology standpoint. I don't understand any of it. But what I do understand is that, 3 people left Elon Musk's orbit, but somehow stayed in his orbit. So it's an example where it's okay for your people that are working for you to go off on their own and be successful on their own and maintaining a relationship. There's abundance in that. When we've all done this, someone leaves your employment and you hold a grudge against them. They go off to a competitor or they go to their own thing and you're upset about it. Apparently, that isn't the case with Elon. He let him go, and then he brought him right back. And I think there's a lesson there and we talked about this in one of our podcasts about your circle of friends and maintaining good relationships and social relationships and so forth. I think it's a great lesson. So technology, I don't know what the hell they're talking about.
I don't think understanding the technology is important. I think it's understanding that there's people smarter than us that are creating these technologies and that it's going to create more abundance in the world, right? It's whether it means better technology for compute, cheaper compute, more, whatever, more of whatever. All of this is going to stack on top of each other. And, I think it's all of these future science fiction tropes are coming together simultaneously, I think is what's happening.
Yeah, not to bring us down, but the movement out there, there are movements out there that want to slow this stuff down, right?
Not to bring us down, but I'm going to anyway. All right, moving on.
It's just something to consider.
I do think, Randy, it's probably worth noting, and this might be kind of a transfer into the next topic maybe, but the being mindful as we talk about abundance, about the counter forces of propaganda. Like, I think that geopolitical competitors would love to slow us down in the US. And so, and we have such an open, free system that it's relatively easy to get inside of our system to influence that system through propaganda, through lobbying, through, and we have some controls, but I think we have to question whether or not we have the right controls. But I've had conversations with friends and with, family members that I have to think to myself, like, where am I getting information that could be propaganda versus really good information? And propaganda can come from geopolitical competitors. It can come from our own government. Like, and without becoming kind of an unhealthy conspiracy theorist, understanding what the source of the information is probably pretty important.
Let's move to our next topic. We could unpack this one for a while, but in the last couple of weeks, Anthropic claimed they had Mythos 5, didn't launch it, or just gave it to 100 or 200 companies, something like that. And then they came out with Fable 5, which was a dumbed down version of Mythos from what we're supposed to be led to believe. And even that was pulled after a couple of days. The government said, no, this is too powerful. And they limited who they could give it to, but because, Anthropic couldn't do that, they just dropped it for everybody. So I used it for half a day before they took it away. Not enough to, have a big opinion. And then OpenAI just launched ChatGPT 5.6, and they did it on a limited, again, the government is saying, this is, we need to okay this. It's not going out to everybody, so it's going out really limited. While simultaneously, China's Z.AI, who I'd never heard of, released GLM 5.2, and supposedly they're saying is as good as Fable, Mythos, this new chat. They're on the same level. So just, man, this stuff is moving so fast. It's hard to keep up with. It's just breakthrough after breakthrough. So what are your guys' takeaways? I mean, I guess I want to get into the government restricting this stuff is where.
Yeah. First things first for me is I now I have a podcast or two that I listen to every single day to keep up with this stuff. It's just a digest. And I feel a little bit like, the president's morning brief where you get like what's happening. And just for me to feel like I'm keeping up, and I don't even feel like I'm at the bleeding edge of it. I feel like I'm just staying up with it, not staying ahead of it. And so that's a part of, because I think this is a really important skill set for what I'm doing professionally. So I can't remember a time where I felt like I had to keep up just technologically every single day at any point in my career until now.
And even then, I'm the same way, John. I don't think I can keep up even trying to. Anthony, what's your takeaway on this?
Well, I don't, I'm with you guys, but I'm taking a different kind of approach. I'll just be a fast follower into whatever the newest thing is going to be. There's a race going on here. I'm not sure what it's a race to. Is it a race to the bottom in terms of what these things are going to cost? I know that the ZAI has some issues, according to some people I've listened to, in terms of its ability to deliver accurate information. For example, it's a China-based AI, but it's censored. So if you type in Tiananmen Square, what happened in whatever it was, you won't get an answer. So and this is, you're talking about government manipulation or government involvement. There's a concern here, again, not to bring us down, but there is a concern that these, other than Elon's X, that there's some censorship and some, not disinformation, but maybe some manipulation of information going on based on the biases that exist in the leadership of some of these companies. So, one thing is the technology. It's moving fast. It can deliver a lot of stuff, but what and how it's delivering and the biases that are being delivered is concerning to me. So we'll see.
All right. Well, we got to wrap this up in the interest of time. I have a lot of thoughts. I will just summarize them into, I think the government limiting this is asinine, is probably the nicest thing I can say about it, because it wasn't that long ago that the Chinese models were supposedly a year to 2 years behind. Then they were a year behind. Then they were 9 months behind. Then 6 months. Then 3 months. Now they're not very much behind. And I just think that limiting your newest model, you can't limit this in every country in the world. We can limit it in the US, but it's not going to limit what comes out of China or any other country that comes up with things. So I think this is a fool's errand, but, that's what the government does. So anyway, I think it's pretty exciting that all this is coming, and it's going to create more of the breakthroughs like we had, with the lasers, and all of these things are going to be expedited by more knowledge. And I just have to believe that, people are basically good, and that good will, defeat the evil. So anyway, everybody go out, spread a little bit of abundance this week.